guys, and welcome to Tenacity Podcast with your host. My name is Gavin, and my drummer over here is Josh. Josh, welcome to the podcast. All right, guys, hope you guys are ready for some exciting talk today. We are going to be talking about the future of rock and where do we want to see. Josh, where do you want to see rock in the next few years?
Well, I would love to see rock just continue its passion. You know, passion is what drives all these rock bands that we love and we listen to over the years. You know, I think back to, from the time it started all the way till now, and what drives it is going to be passion and obviously longevity, and that goes with passion. So I believe that the term rock is dead, and you would agree with me. I think a lot of rockers will agree that the term rock is dead is very false. It's never been dead. I never bought that it was dead for a minute. I think it's very much alive, and it'll stay alive as long as there's people that have the love and the passion for what they do.
Yeah, I believe it was Gene Simmons who was quoted with saying that rock and roll has been killed. And then a couple of weeks later, I think it was, they asked AC/DC what they thought. And Brian Johnson and Angus Young, best response, who said that? Gene Simmons said that. He's like, oh, no, we don't. And I love what Brian Johnson says about rock music. One of the greatest, like, in all honesty, the rock band. If you're looking for, like, I want to know a tip, like, what a rock band, like, the purest form of rock could be, AC/DC did. And they're still going to this day.
Absolutely.
So as far as rock being dead, I mean, you got people like them still going now, and they're going into their 70s. So they're not, I don't know how much longer they're going to go. That still remains to be seen. But he says rock is an ever-changing genre. There's always going to be rock. There's just going to be depending on what form rock is going to take. And we've seen so many bands just come onto the scene since then. So thinking about AC/DC and Kiss have been around for ages. I mean, they were coming around. That Kiss, of course, is probably a little bit older, but AC/DC coming on the scene not too long after them, just coming from two different sides of the map. So,
and you know the song, and you know we're talking as we pertain to the future of rock. You know, one of the best anthems I think for the future of rock, even though it's one out of the past, it's a classic that everyone loves. AC/DC, as we mentioned, for those about to rock, we salute you. I think that is a great song for future rock bands for the future because ultimately it's a big thing, you know, to have your passion, to display your passion. And I mean, what better way to show your passion than with rock music? And AC/DC is a great example. When you think about passion, how can you get more passionate than AC/DC about what they do? I mean, you talk about longevity. You talk about what any band would aspire to be like. AC/DC is the great example.
Absolutely. And so, like, for the future, like, we're kind of going back into how we're seeing rock bands change. So AC/DC is one that, from what I understand, they never change their tune. They stay the same. And then we get, because they stay the same, they create such an incredible sound that they stuck with. And then we get new bands who test that. So who was it? Metallica is like another evolution of rock music. They just took it and they just made it as heavy as possible. And so we get heavy songs like Sad But True that's tuned in a totally different tuning just to see like how heavy can we go and how far can we push the boundaries. And then not only that, their whole thing was like, how much faster can we play a song? Like, I know we can play a song fast, but how much faster? And then we get songs like Master of Puppets. And so music constantly changing. We get bands like Bon Jovi that rise onto this scene with keyboard. Now there's a bunch of synth that they've added to their band. So rock and roll constantly changing. So as far as like what we can expect to see, in my own opinion, is that I think we see more and more creative bands. I don't know if you've seen, there's some videos that are out right now. There's a guy, I have to look up the name, but this band has this huge instrument. I don't know what it is. It looks like it's a ton of different pipes that are going through it that make different sounds. and the
Oh,
lead
wow.
singer actually climbs up onto it during shows, and it's part of their sound. So
Oh, yeah.
like we got people who are just inventing different reasons, like different
Mm,
ways to make sound on an instrument. I think the best one is Eddie Van Halen and his
mm,
creativity on the guitar.
yeah.
I didn't know this until I started looking more up on him, but he invented a lot of the parts that go onto his guitar. He
Hmm.
built parts because they didn't make stuff like what he was needing in order to make the sound on his guitar.
Right.
So those are
Man,
just
that
some.
is
Mhm.
that is amazing. That is amazing. You know, like, and it goes all the way back. So if you think back to the 50s, they had never heard anything like an electric guitar when they first heard the electric guitar, and then fast forward to like what we're talking about now. So it really begs the question, like, that I'm thinking of in my mind, like, wow, what, not only with the passion, but what more will they come up with, like new instruments, uh, new sound. I mean, it's limitless. I really believe that rock music is limitless. I think
Absolutely.
it's limitless with everything it can do, um, and it goes. It's like what you're saying. It's like what Eddie Van Halen is another great example. Metallica. I mean, they're all great examples because they really they set the bar high, really high, and um, but for that to happen, and I know it can happen still. It's just the question, I guess, remains is what risk will be what all risk, because the bands like Metallica, they were all about taking risks. So what risk can the bands take in the future? And I think like what you're mentioning, like with something that you've never seen before, maybe some new instruments, maybe some new sounds that we've never heard.
Yeah.
And I think rock is capable of all of that. Bon Jovi, I think I was actually listening to quite a bit of Bon Jovi yesterday, and just listening to Bon Jovi, and just think about him and how unique John Bon Jovi is as a rock star. Just think of how unique he is and his sound. So you think about before that, I don't think anyone had quite heard kind of like harmonies like Bon Jovi had done before. He did something that wasn't done, and so you think, what more can be done? What more can be done with rock? Well, I think that's an interesting question to ask, but I'm excited to see the answers in the future.
Well, I think there's some bands that like love what you're talking about with like bands constantly like adapt. Like one of the things about band rock is that it's always adapting. I think
Mm,
one too is not just in their sound but in their messaging. So if you think
right.
about a band like Green Day, so Green Day
Yes.
was like they had this really cool album, Dookie, come out. They did a great
Hmm.
job with it, and then people just weren't as interested in their music
Hmm.
as grew on. And so in
Hmm.
order, then they come out with a song called American, or a band, just a total new album, American Idiot,
Yeah.
with all
Hmm.
of these, like this whole new messaging that they've chosen to go after, going
Hmm.
after like revolution, war, like they're everything they could possibly get into in this new
Right.
album, shifting their change, and then kind of coming back to the Bon Jovi thing, like Bon Jovi had a certain way that they wrote their music, and as time has grown
Hmm.
on, their music has adapted since then. Because you've
Right.
got
Yeah.
these really very heavy synth rock band that's really good with harmonizing, and then we start getting into uh, as he got older, we start seeing a little bit of that country twang that gets kind of input
Hmm.
into it. It's
Hmm.
enough to where it's still rock music, but it can also be considered country. So
Yeah.
adapting, that's one of the things, like it goes back to what Brian Johnson said, is that it's always adapting. Then we get new up and coming bands, Falling in Reverse. I know that's
Hmm.
one that you've talked about several different times, that I've heard them when they first got started. I
Hmm.
love what they've done. And then when I hear them now, I'm like, whoa, they have like they've done a lot differently to
Hmm.
come where they are now, and they're just a rising band right now.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, with Falling in Reverse, yeah, it's really interesting. Like, so, uh, you know, you listen to their very first album and then you listen to their latest single, and they just take rock into so many different directions, you know, and like their latest single they had with the country artist Jelly Roll, but it's still a rock song mixed with that country feel. But then I had never thought of a song like that before, so I was just listening to it and I was like, wow. So taking rock into all these different directions and making it work, and the lead singer Ronnie, he just to see how far he's come, and he can do all these different kind of, you know, he adds, sometimes he'll add hip hop elements to it, but it's all rock, but he adds these different layers on top of it, and it works. And I think in order to be that way, taking risk is ultimately, I think, what rock and roll has always been about. You know, it has been about rebellion and about taking risk. And I think any up and coming band we mentioned, or any past band, especially the legends, they were all risk takers. When I think about taking risk, and this is relevant for future bands, I was thinking about, we all know the story about, you know, Metallica and how controversial Nothing Else Matters there was, and that was a big risk for the band. And there were some people that didn't think it was a good risk, but ultimately you look at it and it was a great risk, because look how great of a song it is. One of my all-time favorite songs, and look how successful that song was. It was so different than like anything you had heard from them before, but it worked. And it's like what we talk about with Falling in Reverse. When they started adding a little different to their sound, it was controversial at first, but now people are getting used to it. It worked. So I think that's another factor, is risk taking. I think risk taking is very rock and roll, because every rock and roll star in the past or in the present is all about taking risk. You got to take risk. And but yeah, it's like what you said, the Falling in Reverse, just what they're doing. And another band that we talk about who's come a long way, that me and you both have a lot of respect for, and that we like, you know, Black Veil Brides, how much they've evolved, and they take risk also. And so yeah, I'm very excited about the future of rock. I'm not talking about this as like, well, you never know, it could flop or it could be good. No, I'm very optimistic. I'm there's some pessimists out there about it, but I'm very optimistic, because I believe that rock is just going to keep evolving and keep being great. And I'm excited to see what all these bands come up with.
Absolutely. And I love what you're talking about with risk. One band, like two things that come to mind about risk. And the first one, of course, I know we're talking a lot about Bon Jovi, but I mean, I got the Bon Jovi hat on, so I'm kind of partial to them myself, is the risk of the song Living on a Prayer. It's their number one song. And originally it was a risk, because it was different from anything else they put out. And it was considered like, I don't think this is good enough for the album. And it just became this rock and roll anthem. An amazing song, and amazingly well put together. Now it's like a key part of his shows. Like, he has to do that song every time. And then another band that was really good about taking risks. I've actually been recently reading a book from the Beatles lead singer Paul McCartney, and one of the biggest things it seemed like they did was when they didn't just take risks, they were implementing those risks in the recording studio when they were recording it for the album. So when they were getting ready, like, they're like, hey, we got the song put together, we're ready to go, I'm gonna try something new while we're in the recording studio, and we'll see. I mean, there's one where it's I know it was a risk, but it was even, I think it's Ringo Starr went to the bathroom during one of the recordings, and you don't hear him come in until later. And so it's a risk to let that roll, but you're like, you know what? Let's just do it. So I think one of the biggest, and that's a huge part of rock, has always been risk, rebel, and that's the embodiment of rock and roll, is taking those. Most bands, like what other genre of music do you know of that has a guy who will sing super low and then end up in the stratosphere with one of the longest screams you'll ever hear that actually
Mm.
are melodious? I mean, Bon Jovi in the beginning, like his sound. I think the guy from Judas Priest, Rob
Mm.
I believe it's Halford. If I
Mm.
if I have said it wrong in the comments, guys, let me know. Sometimes I know so many different artists' names, and so if I mispronounce the name or something, feel free to let me know. I always want to be able to correct those. But he's one who just does these random different screams, and like the thing with those are risks too. They don't know if
Mm.
they're going to sound good. They'll do them on the recording, be like, man, I don't know if that was a good idea. In fact, some bands like Axl Rose,
Mm.
it'll take forever to get an album out because they want to make sure they want to see which one of their risks that they're taking, like if this is going to sound good.
Right.
And I think, in all honesty, too, like with the future of rock, you're never going to find another genre that's willing to be poor all their
Mm.
life if it meant they got to play one more show.
Right.
I think it
Absolutely.
was Kiss was in a cramped apartment where they would Paul Stanley, their lead singer, would taxi drive during the day. Whenever he took his breaks, he'd go to rehearsal, and then
Mm.
after that, he'd go home. He'd rehearse some more with them because they all lived in the same apartment, and so they would
Right.
do their jobs, and then they would go back there, and then they would rehearse as much. They would cramped up for years. Metallica lived in a shed, and
Mm-hmm.
the way they slept was they were tearing the foam out of the walls and stuffing it
Mm-hmm.
into their pillowcases. I mean,
Yeah.
that stuff hurts.
Yeah.
And so like there's a lot of risk. Like if this doesn't work, what have
Mm-hmm.
you done with your life?
Well, I read about it, and then I heard an interview a while back that Billy Joe Armstrong from Green Day did, and I was not aware of this until I had read about it, and then I heard an interview he was doing on the Howard Stern show, and when Billy Joe Armstrong was really young, he lived in a squat with like a whole bunch of different people. Very uncomfortable environment, very uncomfortable. Um, but it's survival mode. Obviously, you do what you got to do to go to the next step, go to the next level. And I love reading stories like that because it's like you see the risk. There's always a risk story. Like, so what did you do to overcome all this? What did you do for all this? And I love like the fact you mentioned Paul McCartney, obviously someone who I've admired for so long. You know, the Beatles are just naturally invested in me since I was a kid. You know, I like how Paul McCartney said one time. People would always ask because the Beatles have so many albums out, so many albums. Sometimes they would release an album. They'd release like a few albums in the same year or close to this same year. And Paul McCartney said, "Yeah, me and John, we're just always ahead of the curve, and when other people are you know promoting their new album, we're already in the studio writing new songs. We're writing new songs, and the Beatles are, I think, the best example of evolving, because you look at them when they first started out, or when they first came to America. They had their short Beatle haircuts, which back then was considered long hair. It's funny looking back now, but they had their Beatle suits. They had all that, and they were making great music. And then you look at them, the year that they broke up. I mean, their sound was different. Everything was different. And obviously that's what you got to do. You got to keep evolving. But what I like is, like you mentioned, Ringo Starr going to the bathroom and then uh, eventually coming out and going to his drums and doing that. I mean, things that people have never done before. Like, one thing happened. The Beatles had an album in 1966 called Revolver. Great album. And so it's the very first rock album with backwards music on it. And how that came about, and this is just a great story I love hearing. So how that came about was the engineer accidentally put on uh, the tape backwards. It was an accident, just an accident. And John, John and Paul, they all said, "Oh, that actually is a unique sound, even though it was an accident." They said, "Let's leave that in there," not knowing, not knowing if that would cause anything, not knowing if what the outcome would be. But then you have a band, called the Who. Do that later on. You have Jimi Hendrix and some of his stuff do backwards music. But just something simple like that wouldn't be a big deal today, even though it's kind of cool. But something simple that had never been done back then, they're like, "Wow, it's a risk, but hey, let's just see what happens. Let's just roll with it." Yeah. And it still produced a good. Now, not all the songs are backwards, but a few songs are, and that had never been done before. And then, like, you think about a band like Kiss. I'm fast forwarding a little bit. So the 70s, you got Kiss. They were risk takers. I mean, they were risk takers, and I totally understand. Even though as a Kiss fan, I love the makeup, because that's Kiss. That's a part of them. Mm-hmm. But I totally understand why they did away with it for a while, because because they wanted to ultimately show that, hey, the look is cool and everything, but we're not about the look. We're about the music. Now, the look is great. When you think of Kiss, that's what. Obviously you think of them with their makeup and their get up, and it's so awesome. But they wanted to show, like, hey, we're more than just this. We're more than this. Even without the makeup, without the get up, we're still Kiss. We're still the same. I know I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but there's so many great examples of risk taking. So many great examples of, had they been afraid to take risks, think how different things would be. Yeah. I'm repping Queen right now. Mm-hmm. You think of like Freddie Mercury, one of the most unique voices you've ever heard in rock. You think of him and how he took rock opera, and he took opera and mixed it with rock, and the harmonies they did, and then took rock opera, and then it worked, and he was taking a risk by doing it. And so overall, my point, I guess, is like, just, this would pertain to us with what we do in Tenacity, and if there's any other band listening, is never ever be afraid. If there's a risk you want to take, never be afraid to take it, because you never know what will come of it. And ultimately, the bands that we talk about, if they would have been afraid to take risks, then things would be different. So you can't, and that's the thing about rock and roll, rock music in general, don't let people tell you who you are, and don't let people limit you. You can be limitless. So I know I kind of jumped around a little bit, but just so much
yeah. Well, I think another key component too with the rock genre itself has always been, for most parents that like grew up with their kids listening to rock, it almost felt like it almost went too far to a rebel side. Like there was a part of it that they felt was like rebellion, and a lot of it, I think, was kids loved stuff that their parents didn't care for.
Right.
If you tell a child they're not allowed to do something, they're gonna do it. And so you get what is it? There's one band that got fought so hard because of the kind of stuff they did, like Marilyn Manson.
Marilyn Manson.
Big, like, huge shock factor band for a long time. And it seemed like the more that parents fought their kids listening to his music, the bigger he got. The same thing could be said about AC/DC. The more people fought that band, not wanting to get kids to listen to them, the more kids got their albums in their hands. And so the thing with rock is like, it's part of, like, it's almost like there's a youthfulness to it. of like,
You're
yeah,
right.
when I was a kid, I'd listen to this. Like even my own dad, he'll talk about like, yeah, when I was a kid, I used to listen to Skid Row, and Youth Gone Wild was such a big song back then, just because we were crazy listening to
Mm-hmm.
all this stuff. And you hear it now, you're like, man, we got even crazier rock music now
Oh,
than what
absolutely.
that was back then. So I think coming down to the wire, like coming down to the end of the podcast episode,
Mm-hmm.
this episode has been the future of rock, and we've talked a lot about the past, but the point is like we got to talk about the past to understand what the future of rock is. There's been
Absolutely.
there's been a starting point for rock and roll. I mean, it's the 1950s, it's blues, and it's just progressed since then.
Oh
And
yeah.
so we get amazing people like people we've talked about today, the Beatles, we've talked about AC/DC, Kiss,
Mm-hmm.
Bon Jovi, and now we're all the way up to Falling in Reverse. And
Mm-hmm.
these are all bands that have got their own sound. They've tried
Mm-hmm.
something new. And
Yeah.
so, in my own opinion, what I feel summarizes like the future of rock is that rock and roll is always going to be here.
Mm-hmm.
It just, all it takes is somebody who's willing to take a risk
Mm-hmm.
and is willing to essentially rebel against the dynamics of how music is right now. And so, as
Mm-hmm.
long as there is a rebel out there, as long as there's somebody who's a risk taker, who loves to headbang and
Mm-hmm.
loves to express emotions through music,
Right.
the next rock and roller is going to be that same kid that's right now in his room, especially now since social media, jamming to whatever they're playing on guitar, playing it over YouTube. As long as there's people like that still, rock and roll's not going anywhere. It's just a
I
matter of who's going to take the next big risk that's going to be the next big thing in the industry.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And anytime a kid, anytime a kid plugs in an electric guitar or sets up his drums and gets his sticks out or tunes up or warms his vocals up to rock out. I mean, or anytime a band gets together in their garage or anything. I mean, rock and roll is always going to be there. It's going to keep evolving. I can't wait to see, and later down the road we'll talk about it on the podcast to see what more is happening with the genre. And like what me and you are very passionate about it. We are diehard rockers, and like what we're doing, we are passionate about it, and we want to get it. We want to keep talking about it, and it'll really be fun to see in many years time, because we're going to dig this episode up someday, because this is the very first episode we're doing. So it'll be very interesting to go back in the archives and dig this up someday and say, man, look what we were talking about then. And man, we couldn't have imagined years down the road. We couldn't imagine what we're seeing now when we were talking about it on the podcast. So I'm excited about it. I can't wait to see it. And I'm excited too. You see a lot of up and coming bands, and you see a lot of up and coming bands out there. And as long as their passion is there, as long as there's some kind of rebellion to not let other people dictate their limits, only you can decide that, and that's what rock and roll is all about. So everything from Little Richard and Chuck Berry to the first people to do rock and roll, all up until Falling in Reverse and Black Veil Brides and all these great bands and everything. I mean, it's there, and it's gonna keep being there. And someday, Falling in Reverse and Black Veil Brides are gonna be as crazy as it is. It's gonna be considered old rock someday. But that's how it works, right? I mean, that's how it works. So the future is looking bright. I'm really excited about it.
Absolutely. All right, guys. Well, that is it for today's episode. We want to thank you guys for being for watching with us. If you enjoyed the music at the beginning of this episode and the one that's going to be playing at the end, that is actually part of the band that me and Josh are part of, Tenacity. And if you'd like to listen to more of that, you can find it on our social media platforms. Whatever platform you're watching this on, you'll be able to find the song on there under our channel as well. And we look forward, link will also be in the description for it. And we look forward to seeing you guys on the next episode. Until then, keep on rocking in the free world, y'all.
Rock on, guys.